As I mentioned, we have a semi-surprise addition to this section of the program now with Saul Eslake to provide a discussant role. To many of the Australians, I think Saul would be well known, and potentially to some of our Indonesian friends here online. But Saul is one of Australia's best known economists. He has been following, analysing and offering commentary and advice on the Australian and other economies for more than 40 years. Saul is often referred to as Australia's best number cruncher by the media. Since June 2020, Saul has been an associate of Llewellyn Consulting, a London-based independent economics advisory firm specialising in thought leadership, strategic research and analysis. He's also a member of the International Conference of Commercial Bank Economists. His national acknowledgement includes a member of the panel of expert advisors to Australia's Parliamentary Budget Office and a member of the independent expert panel advising the Australian Taxation Office. He's also a non-executive director of the Macquarie Point Development Corporation and a member of the advisory board of Jamieson Coote Bonds. Saul, if you wouldn't mind also as a part of your presentation, just give a bit of a sense of your Indonesian experience and connection as well, that'd be appreciated. So over to you. Thank you, Saul.
Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. Selamat siang dan selamat pagi, Pak Chris Legowo, Pak Indra Daramawan, dan para hadirin yang terhormat. Jeff, just to pick up your question there, yes, I was, among other things, chief economist of ANZ Bank for 14 years, and ANZ had a significant presence in Jakarta, including through an alliance they had with a bank in Indonesia. And I used to visit Indonesia quite regularly in that capacity, and I think have presented at one of the AIBC conferences in Bali, which was a particularly pleasant experience for me. And then subsequently, when I worked for Bank of America Merrill Lynch, I would also visit, in particular, Bank Indonesia in Jakarta in that capacity. So I'd like to think that I have a good understanding of the Indonesian economy, as well as an appreciation for the broader relationship between our two neighbours. So in this context, I thought I'd just make three broad observations that I hope are relevant to the theme of investment and collaboration between Australia and Indonesia, particularly in the area of healthcare. My first observation is that the investment climate in Indonesia is, I think, very good, and probably the best it's been since before the crisis of the late 1990s. And just one way of highlighting that is that last week the IMF released its most recent economic forecasts out to 2026. And for Indonesia, they show that the IMF expects growth in economic activity of 5.7% per annum over the 5 years to 2026. And what struck me is that's faster than China, for which the IMF is forecasting growth of 5.2%. And there aren't many economies in the world who can say that over a 5-year period, they're looking at faster growth than China. And given the change in relations between Australia and China in particular, and more broadly, the difficulties that now exist in China's relationships with a wide range of countries, the fact that our nearest neighbour is able to say it's expecting faster growth than China does really underscore the point that Pak Ivan made in his presentation there about Indonesia potentially being part of the solution to those countries and those businesses that are looking to reduce their reliance on China as a single source of supply. Just a couple of other things about the IMF forecasts that I think speak well to the macro investment environment in Indonesia. First, they're forecasting inflation of 3%, which by Indonesian standards is low and stable and consistent with BI's inflation target. They're also suggesting that public debt, which in Indonesia, like other countries, has risen as a result of what governments have had to do in order to deal with COVID, will nonetheless be 40% of GDP by the end of 2026. That's less than Australia, for which the forecast is 43. And the final point in those forecasts was that the IMF's expecting Indonesia's current account deficit to be an average of 1.75% of GDP over the 5-year period, which is again very low by Indonesian standards. It's lower than the growth rate. And all of these things, I think, point to the prospect of the rupiah being stable, which is an important consideration for foreign investors. And given how unstable the rupiah has been over the last 20 years, the prospect of an extended period of stability in the currency, I think, is very encouraging. And of course, that in turn partly reflects the confidence that Indonesia's fiscal and monetary authorities have gained by the way they've responded to the economic policy challenges that COVID has thrown up. So, as I say, my first point is that the broad macro investment climate for Indonesia is, I think, very favourable at this point. The second thing, which has been touched on by some of the other speakers, in particular by Pak Indra Darmawan, is that what I call the microeconomic climate within Indonesia has also improved from an investment perspective. That's partly as a result of some of the things that Pak Legowo referred to in his opening remarks, in particular the omnibus job creation law that does consciously seek to remove some of the red tape that businesses, both domestic and foreign, have to contend with in Indonesia, and also the opening of a single window for approval of foreign investment by BKRM, I think, is an important step forward in improving the investment climate. But from an Australian perspective in particular, of course, as all the speakers have referred to, EACPA has opened some significant opportunities for Australian businesses that are not open to other countries that might have an interest in Indonesia. And while the headline refer to 99% of goods being tariff-free, I think from the perspective of today's forum, the really important thing is the improved access that Australian businesses and investors are now going to have to some pretty significant sections of the Indonesian economy, and in particular in services. And that sort of brings me to my third point, which is specifically in relation to healthcare. Last year, the World Bank moved Indonesia up into what it calls the grouping of upper middle income developing countries. And what that specifically relates to is that Indonesia has just recently moved past the benchmark of per capita GDP measured in purchasing power parities of $15,000 per head. And the significance of that is that history tells us that countries whose per capita incomes exceed between about $15,000 and $20,000 per head at purchasing power parities are ones where the proportion of the economic activity that's in the form of services starts to grow quite significantly, rather than it being mainly about the production of goods or mining. And within that, clearly, healthcare is going to be increasingly important. You know, two developments, obviously, since 2014, the rolling out of universal basic healthcare to all the people of Indonesia, to the point where Indonesia is, as I understand it, likely to have the fourth biggest universal healthcare system in the world when it's completed. But also, as I think Pak Nurul referred to this in his presentation earlier, that a significant proportion of Indonesia's population, maybe of the order of 50 million, who are regarded as being the middle class, want better healthcare for themselves and their families than the basic provision. And a number of those, 600,000, I think was the number that Pak Nurul referred to, and I've read that number elsewhere, are willing to go overseas for medical procedures. Now, they mostly go to Singapore and Malaysia because that's close, but clearly there's an opportunity for Australia in that space. My sense is, from the reading I've done, that the particular potential for Australian investment in Indonesia in the healthcare space comes down to maybe four areas in particular. The first of those being what others have referred to as capacity building, that is, in particular, providing training and experience for people working in the health and aged care sectors at varying levels of skills, but all sorts of skills are going to be in increased demand as Indonesia's population grows and more people acquire middle class status and the tastes that go with it. Second really important thing is digital healthcare services, where Indonesia has quite significant capacity already, but also significant needs, which some Australian businesses are well placed to help supply. A third area that has potential, I think, is in relation to medical and surgical devices and equipment, and we've already had two examples of that in the panel discussion. And then finally, I think there's a role for Australian businesses in assisting and collaborating with Indonesia in areas like diagnostic testing and pathology, and areas like that where the demand is likely to increase significantly. So I hope I haven't exceeded the time that was allocated to me, Jeff, and can I just say terima kasih for allowing me to be part of this forum. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Saul. No, you've done exceptionally well on the timing, and could have probably gone for another minute or so, although we do have some questions. And I really like those last 4 points that you outlined about the opportunity that relates to healthcare between the two countries. And you mentioned digital as the second one, as most people would realise that's a key area of interest for myself. But I think the full scope of those 4 areas is something that the healthcare group for AIBC, and I think the sector more generally in Australia is very keen to progress.
It might also be, Jeff, that there are aspects of Australia's Royal Flying Doctor Service, yes, and the programs that we run for Indigenous communities in remote parts of the Northern Territory, Queensland and Western Australia. And I guess I'm here thinking more about government ones rather than the private ones Bruce was mentioning, which he's already talked about, that might have applications in some of the more remote parts of Eastern Indonesia and in West Papua. Obviously not for heavily populated areas like Java, but in some of the more remote parts of Indonesia, there may be aspects of those programs we've developed for remote and Indigenous communities that have an application in Indonesia as well.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Saul and Bruce, for your comments. I think I'll bring this panel session to a close now. And just in closing, I'd just like to thank our panel members, Parnural, Bu Arianti, Rebecca, Bruce, Ivan, and also Saul for your discussant section at the end there. Very a good summary, I think, of the key points, and brought together the topic quite nicely. So really appreciate it. So thanks, everyone.